we'll get going. But yeah, so for those that, if this is your first time coming to one of our events, we are a nonprofit based in Central Texas, in Austin specifically, and we are member supported. And this last month, we surpassed our 1,000th member. And so we also have ways for you to get involved by becoming a volunteer. You can also become a member that way. And becoming a member allows for you to get kind of priority notice and advance notice on opportunities to myceliate. We also have discounted member tickets. And so that's one of the other benefits. We also offer, we have a Discord chat. So you're welcome to, members are welcome to join a chat. And it's just a private way for people to connect online. There's a couple of other benefits as well, but largely it's a way for you to support mycology education for everyone. And so we're still working, we're still volunteer run, we're still working to be able to, employ people to and create jobs in mycology, which is something that's very difficult. It's one of the most underfunded areas of science, even though we all know that mycology is foundational to terrestrial life. So it's sort of like, y'all wouldn't be here if we didn't care about mycology. Anyways, that's enough for me. But yeah, so if you are not yet a member, we hope that you will join us. And with that, I'm gonna get us started on indoor mushroom cultivation. So Austin Davenport is a member. He's part of our leadership team. And I met him through Central Texas Young Farmers at a happy hour and gotten to know him just over his love of gardening, love of mushrooms. And I was so excited when he wanted to teach indoor mushroom cultivation because it's something I don't do. And that there's a lot of people that want to learn how to do this. And so we do a lot with our low-tech cultivation, reusing the mushroom blocks from the block recycling program that we do with the mushroom farms here in Central Texas. But there's ways to continue to grow mushrooms through the heat. And so once things get up to 80 degrees, it's time to bring things indoors and create a simulated environment that's ideal for mushrooms. So that's what we're going to learn tonight. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Austin. And if you can just take us on a spore ride.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Angel. Well, yes, gardening outdoors and gardening mushrooms outdoors is a lot more passive. But when you're moving indoors with mushrooms, the mushrooms are going to lean on you. So it's going to be very active and you're going to be responsible for all their care and needs. It may seem really intimidating at first, but we're going to break it down. We're going to make it really easy to understand. We have a QR code at the end of the presentation, so you can take this material with you home and always have it as a reference. And sometime throughout the presentation, we're just going to do some live demoing stuff. We're going to show you like how to inoculate an agar plate, inoculate a grain bag, and go through everything. Hopefully today you'll leave as knowledgeable as I am and as any home mycologist growing tons of mushrooms at home is. So without further ado, let's get into mushroom sterilization and home cultivation. All right, so today's topics are going to be reviewing sterilization and its importance. We're going to go over a cultivation vocabulary. There's lots of terms that get thrown around, and sometimes you might not know what they are, but we're going to review those first. That way, when I bring them up later and you see them on various YouTube channels you might follow up with, you'll know what that term means. We're going to go over equipment, and we're going to go into creating a culture library and why you might want to do that, might want to help some citizen science creating a cultural library. And then the last thing we're going to do is go through the full start to process indoor mushroom sterile cultivation techniques. So In the realm of fungi, there's lots of competition for substrates. Out in the wild, you can kind of expect your mushrooms to win out some races or lose some races, but you'll find the winners of those races out in the wild or in your garden. Here, you're going to need to make sure that you keep things as sterile as possible to make sure that your specific cultivar wins those battles. And we'll make sure that it does by providing ideal growing conditions, sterile techniques, and we can help our specific mushroom cultivar we're trying to grow out thrive to a bountiful harvest. And to ensure that survival and excellence, we're going to utilize specific equipment that we can build ourselves, such as flow hoods and sterile air boxes. And these pieces of equipment will help us improve our substrate preparation, our inoculation, our reproduction techniques, just so that we can be as set up for success as possible. So these are all of our glossary terms. We're going to start off with mycelium, which is the body of the fungus, and that usually creates an underground network that we see visually as hyphae, all that like beautiful, beautiful threads. That's all hyphae and mycelium. Now, a mushroom culture is mycelium of a specific type of mushroom, generally referred to in some sort of stored device for cultivation. And our next glossary term is substrates, which is just any material that mushrooms grow. Pretty simple there. Inoculation is the process of introducing a specific mushroom to spawn or to substrate in order to colonize it and let it feed on that stuff, creating mushrooms for you. Grain spawn. Grain spawn is a colonized carrier of which the mushroom cultivar will be used to be introduced into a final substrate. And examples of that are like rice and millet. Colonization. Colonization is the process in which a specific mushroom variety takes over a substrate. And then we have flush. And flush is a cycle of mushroom crops. So once your mycelium fully colonizes substrate and you start getting mushrooms, that is your first flush. And that'll be followed by subsequent flushes. And then pinning. Pinning is when you start to see all the little teeny tiny mushrooms start to pop out from the surface of the substrate. And that's when you sort of see the fruit developing. All right. So flow hood and still air boxes. A flow hood is a piece of equipment that regulates contamination in the air. So right now in your apartment or your home or wherever, there's all these little floating bits of different yeasts and funguses and stuff like that. And if that falls onto your sterile substrate, it's going to try to take it over and it's going to try to take it away from the mushroom you're trying to grow. And this sort of stuff helps you maintain those things, get them out of here, and allow you to do any sort of sterile processes. Flow hoods are pretty expensive, but I've seen plenty of people build them DIY. I think the cheapest one I've seen someone build an effective flow hood, and there's a lot that goes into building an effective flow hood versus maybe accidentally putting an air filter on a fan, which isn't a flow hood. There's a lot to get in there. There's lots of great YouTube videos for that, but it's pretty difficult, but not impossible. But $100 is the cheapest you could probably build an effective one for. I'm a big advocate for still air boxes. They're a really low cost, really easy to make alternative to a flow hood that'll still create a semi-sterile work environment. And using a still air box, again, is not going to be as effective as a flow hood, but for home cultivation, it can definitely get the job done. All right, so these are going to be your basic materials. We have 70% isopropyl alcohol and bleach. So I have a table here. I bleached it down. I'm going to bleach my surfaces, but for equipment and stuff, for the things that I'm working with my hands, all of that's going to be used with isopropyl alcohol. It's very important that we use 70% isopropyl alcohol here. It's sort of like a longer lasting cleaner than like a 90% or a bleach. Those solutions are so potent that they kind of dissolve in the air really quickly, but 70% is effective enough to stick around for a little bit, keeping that sterile presence around. Gloves are really important. You really shouldn't be doing any of these processes we're covering without gloves. Masks and hats are optional. You can see here I have my hair all nice and put away. I don't have it in my face or throwing whatever's in my hair on top of my agar plates or my mycelium or any of that nonsense. And then labeling material. Most mycelium kind of looks like other mycelium, so you want to make sure that you have labeling materials at the ready to label your agar plates or your grain bags, just so that you know what's what, maybe put a date on there and track your progress. All right, so this is the start to finish cultivation roadmap. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with either spores or cloning tissue. We're going to get into that again a little bit later, but you take these sort of reproductive materials and we're going to propagate those into a mycelium culture. And that's going to be some sort of water-based solution or agar plate solution where the mycelium is going to slowly start to eat away at those things and start to grow from a baby to an infant as far as like the mycelium goes. And then that's going to get upgraded to a grain spawn. You're going to introduce your mycelium culture into grain spawn that you've sterilized or that you buy pre-sterilized. And that's going to slowly be the next step up into adolescence for your mushroom. Your end substrate is sort of your adult, you're ready to reproduce end mushroom cycle. And that's sort of when it's going to, the mushroom is the reproductive material of the fungus. So it'll shoot out the mushroom will shoot out spores. But before it does that, we're going to take it, we're going to eat it, we're going to fry it up. And as that first flush comes around, that'll be about 3 weeks after introducing your grain spawn to that. And then you'll get subsequent flushes, but it's a law of diminishing returns here. Your fungus only wants to create mushrooms to shoot out spores to reproduce. If you feed it more substrate, if you feed it more food, it's just going to still kind of teeter out because it's already done its job. It's on the way out. So subsequent flushes are really, really great. Definitely don't throw out your substrate after the first flush. Keep it around for the second or the third, but you should expect harvests to be smaller and a little bit more infrequent, taking longer. And then the last step to the cultivation roadmap is cloning or recycling. You can either take your spent substrate and use it to put into a basket with hay and put it outside, or you can put it in a compost pile, or you can bury it. Just make sure that it's recycling and going back into the ground at the end of the day. All right, so we're going to get into agar plates, slants, and syringes. Each one is shown on the screen here. Thanks to North Spore for these photos. Big fan of them. So your agar plates are on the left here. You can see a tiny, tiny bit of an actual cloning tissue in that slant, that tube. And then we have the syringes on the end. All right. So genetics of mushrooms are typically going to be stored in one of these 3 devices. Agar plates are going to be the easiest to use at home. I would recommend buying poured and sterile agar plates as opposed to making your own agar solution at home. It's not impossible, but I think I get my bang for the buck by letting like an actual lab take care of that part for me and just shipping me sterile agar to use. Syringes and slants are almost always going to be bought instead of made at home. That said, it's still totally possible to do that if you want to be a mad scientist, mycologist, just like making slants at home and distributing them to the community. That's amazing. We definitely need more of that. But agar plates are still just going to be your most commonly used storage device. Slants are more so used for like larger scale, big time mycology people like mushroom businesses or mushroom cultivars, or just big people who have access to labs. And then syringes are going to be common when you're buying a new cultivar that you don't actually own. So I don't own any agar plates of Black Trumpet, but I did go out and buy a syringe of Black Trumpet mycelium that I'm going to use today. And that's why I would want a syringe or a slant or an agar plate. And you can store these up to about 3 months in the fridge. All right, so we're going to get into cloning. You're going to want to the mushroom you want to clone, you want to find a nice fruiting body of a mushroom you're going to clone. And you're going to want to completely disinfect that mushroom, making it unable to be eaten, but it's going to be used for something far more grandiose. You're going to gently rip the mushroom in half, as we see in this photo, and just grab some tissue from the core of the mushroom as central to the mushroom body as possible. And we're going to place that on agar and let that colonize out. As if we go back real quick, you can see again on that middle picture, that's a tiny bit of tissue in the same sort of cloning process. And that's what's going to be used to reproduce mushrooms and start our whole cultivation process. All right. So cloning. Mushroom spores are very similar in function to plant seeds. Seeds and spores, however, don't always grow true to type. Genetics in spores and seeds can differ from their parents, resulting in divergent offspring. And for this reason, we will actually extract tissues directly from the mushroom itself. This will require taking tissues from within the core of the fruiting body in order to clone the mushroom. This the principle of this process is very similar to why you would take like a cutting off of a tree or a plant just to get a genetically identical plant. You want a genetically identical mushroom. Place the extracted piece on a bit of agar and let the mycelium develop. Be sure to try to get mushroom samples from the largest fruit you have to get the best genetics. This is kind of really contamination prone, but it's okay to like have mycelium or use mycelium from a contaminated agar plate. What you're going to want to do is try to find mycelium from the furthest away from any sort of contamination, and then you can use that, try to put it on another agar plate, and hopefully that plate will be less contaminated than the first plate. But you just have to do it in batches to get the contamination out of there before you use that plate to go to grain. So it's mushroom culture, mushroom tissue to agar, agar to grain, grain to final substrate. All right. And now that you have an idea of how cloning works, you can like go out into the woods and find a cool mushroom and say like, I've never seen this before. I'm going to take it home. I'm going to carefully go into my still air box, extract a piece of tissue, try to propagate it out on agar and call up UT. Hey, I got this crazy mushroom. Can we do some DNA sequencing? And you'd be helping out everybody and it'd be really cool. Or if you just find like some random mushroom you really enjoy, just maybe take some cloning tissues, start your own culture library. And you can always take an agar plate of mycelium and use it to make more agar plates of that mycelium, just copying and pasting over, and everything will work out just fine. You can store your agar plates in the fridge, keep it under 38 degrees, anything higher than that, and it's going to dramatically reduce the shelf life. And again, this stuff is very contamination prone, so you're going to want to get some other dedicated Tupperware that's nice, airtight, and put your mushroom cultivars in there. Ideally, you go out and find a mini fridge, hopefully at a pawn shop that you can get it on the cheap, and make that your culture library. All right, so we're going to get into grains here. So we'll take a look at this photo first. You can see that that is a self-healing injection port, and you stick your syringe in there, you give it just a little bit of juice, and then you can see after a week, the mycelium, the hyphae, starts to colonize the grain. After about 2 weeks, it's colonizing more of it. And after 3 weeks, it's starting to really overrun the bag. After the bag is fully overrun, that's when we can mix it up and introduce it into a final substrate. But we're just going to go over some grain tips here. After about a week, after about a week, you're going to start looking for any sort of contamination, any sort of green spots, blue spots, anything that's not that nice white hyphae. You're going to want to use about 2.5 to 5 cc's of liquid culture per 3-pound bag. It's really just like a few pumps, just a couple drops here, a couple drops there, goes a long way when it comes to using syringes. I could stick a syringe and give all that liquid culture to a grain bag, but it wouldn't do anything to better my chances. In fact, it would probably lessen my chances. It's introducing a lot of extra moisture that you don't want. Any extra moisture in a grain bag is going to be more problematic than helpful. And just a tiny couple of drops of liquid culture will be enough to colonize an entire bag. You're going to want to shake your syringe vigorously because this stuff is really clumping together in there. So I'm going to be constantly shaking this throughout the presentation. And before using the syringe, you're going to empty out the first 5 cc's or so. Like the tippy top of the syringe is mostly like the liquid solution and not enough mycelium. So I'm going to shoot out a little bit of that into a dish, not use that. And then I'll have a much more emulsified solution in here. All right. And you're always going to want to flame sterilize your syringe before you use it, and between an agar plate to another agar plate or any other project to another project. It's just a good practice. All right. So there are multiple types of grains you can choose from in mushroom cultivation. There's rye, there's millet, there's brown rice, and those seem to be the leading grains across the board. But the deciding factors are usually points of inoculation. How easy is it for mushroom mycelium to get in there and colonize everything? What's the price of that grain? Are you going to start going in the red before you start going in the green as far as like value out of your hobby? And then the last factor is contamination rates. Some things can contaminate over other things a lot easier, like rye is a lot less likely to contaminate than wheat, but some places still like to use wheat and they're just better about their sterilization. Brown rice is usually championed for having the largest yields of your fruiting bodies at the very end of the day, but it's kind of negligible. So it's not something to sweat like, hey, if you have just a bunch of birdseed on hand, if you have popcorn on hand, it's the differences are going to be negligible, so it's not a big deal which grain you choose. But I'd like to mention the break and shake method. So as we start to see the colonization on the grain, it's good to just like shake that up and redistribute it so that all that mycelium has more points to shoot out from and start to colonize your grain bag. If I just didn't ever shake my grain as I introduced mycelium to it, it would take much longer than if I did the break and shake technique.
So a few
And
questions coming in on the chat.
let's do it.
We want to take a break. So yeah, one was a few minutes back when you're talking about agar plates. So for the agar plates, this is what Stephanie asks. Is a certain percentage agar required? Should it be made with nutrient broth or just water?
It's usually made with like a malt solution, and you can find there's mostly only like one recipe I see running around, and so if you just put like agar malt solution pour recipe into your search engines, you should find it. It's pretty easy. You just like simmer a bunch of it, you pour it in while it's still hot, and then you wipe down your physical plate plastic, and then you can store that in some place that's also really sterile. Over here, I have a box of already sterilized, sealed agar plates. I got these for maybe like $20, and I have like 5 or 6 in here, which I'd say is a good deal. I don't want to deal with that hassle, but if you feel passionate about it, I would heavily encourage it.
Okay, and then generally, how long can you store colonized agar plates in sub 38
Uh,
degrees?
3 months. If everything goes right, if they're not sitting there next to like a piece of moldy bread, you can go for about 3 months. And you can set a timer on your phone and be like, hey, it's about 3 months. I haven't done anything with this agar plate. I'll just transfer some to a new agar plate, start the process over again.
Okay, and then which grain is the most beginner friendly to start with?
The most beginner friendly grain is probably going to be millet. It might be harder to find, but it's going to be the easiest. It's what you'll find like the most common as far as like, hey, I want to go and buy some sterile substrate. What's the most likely substrate I'll find from all the different vendors? It's going to be millet.
Okay, and then let's see. So someone was just asking probably a better question for the community, but someone that was just wanting to know if somebody could come check out her setup. She's new to the group. What part of the country are you in? And I'm talking to RGMCC. Okay, I see. And Brian, maybe
Hmm.
B slash, oh, College Station. Brian, College Station. Gotcha. Yeah, there's several people from that area. So definitely connect, y'all. That's what we're about. And use that chat, share your info, connect on socials. If you're a member, definitely figure out what your Discord handle is, what cryptic Discord handle you have. Okay, and so Annette asks, I used to work in a microbiology lab. Do you use a Bunsen burner to sterilize your syringes?
I've found these like really weird handle torches at like vape shops, and I see those as far as like the most common thing on home scale when I'm watching like other mycology YouTubers and stuff. There's also this crazy device that's like a metal tube, and you just like put your syringe needle in there, or like your X-Acto knife in there, and it just sucks a bunch of hot air into the tube, fully sterilizing it. Unfortunately, I just have a regular old hand lighter today. Don't do that. Don't use those. Find something a little bit stronger, like a creme brulee torch or something like that. That'll be your safest bet. You really just want to get the metal kind of like red hot for a minute, and that's good enough. All right. Any others?
Ready to keep going?
Let's do it. All right. So, how to sterilize grain. So, we've been talking about grain, but you can't use your grain until you sterilize it first. There are many different ways of doing this, but on the home scale, a pressure cooker is probably going to be your most effective tool for the job. And an Instapot is also perfectly suitable. The first thing you're going to want to do is get a kitchen scale, which is also great for baking. If you're into baking, definitely grab a kitchen scale. You're also going to need it for your mushroom cultivation. Um, you're gonna weigh out about 1,000 grams of dry grain and 500 milliliters of water. You're gonna let it soak for about 12 hours or overnight in order to partially hydrate. And from there, we're gonna partially dry it so that there's still quite a bit of moisture in there, but it's not sopping wet. And you can do that by laying it flat on a sheet pan with a paper towel or two. It's ideally somewhere dry for about 2 to 3 hours. I like ovens. Ovens are very arid. If you have like a dehumidifier somewhere, you can place your drying grain over there. And then the second step from there is we're going to add our soaked grain that we dried out a little bit into either a mason jar or a unicorn bag. The unicorn bag is just the most common bag you see, like in our mushroom block giveaway program. Those are unicorn bags. You can find them online for pretty cheap, but I find that mason jars are reusable and not a bunch of plastic going into the landfill. You're going to place those in a pressure cooker. You see I have a tiny little diagram off to the side there showing the water level. And then I put some physical barrier like a steaming basket upside down so that no bag, no jar is touching water. It's sitting above the water. And if you do put any grain in water in the bags or the jars, you'll probably see some sort of pops or explosions or cracks, and we don't want any of that. I also like to put some sort of weight on top. Typically, I'll use like a ceramic plate, and that'll just keep any of the grain or gas in the grain from kind of expanding and not looking nice and maybe popping out. So just a nice level on bottom, a platform on bottom, keeping the bags and the grains out of the water, and then a weight on top, sandwich your grains perfectly between those inside your pressure cooker. And we're going to go at, what did I say here? 15 psi for about two. Yes. Bringing this to a boil, 15 psi for about 2 hours is the way to go. All right. So we're going to talk mushroom substrate here. And I'm going to have to unplug my headphones real quick. So mushroom substrate is very tricky. There's lots to know there. I found this 10-minute video by this wonderful man, Tony from Fresh Cat Mushrooms. If you aren't watching this YouTube channel yet, you definitely should. He's got tons of resources. And so I'm just going to let him talk about mushroom substrate so I don't have to.
Substrates. First are substrate. So what do mushrooms actually grow on? Mushrooms are different from plants in many ways, but one of the most obvious and the most important is that instead of just planting them in the soil, you need to colonize them on a suitable substrate. In this video, I want to go over the many different substrates that mushrooms grow on and go over 2 of my favorite recipes for growing mushrooms at home. So first of all, what is a mushroom substrate? To put it simply, a substrate is a bulk material that mushroom mycelium can use to grow on to gain energy and nutrition and to eventually food mushrooms. The best mushroom substrate can vary depending on what mushrooms you're trying to grow, what materials are available to you, but they generally consist of a base organic material that the mushroom will use for energy, a little bit of added nutrition that will help.
Whoops. My apologies, real quick.
Full of substrates. First are substrates that don't require sterilization. These are substrates that are low in overall nutrition, but still suitable for growing mushrooms. An old-time favorite is wheat straw. Now, where I live, you can get a 40-pound bale of wheat straw for around $3. And if you properly pasteurize it, you can use it to grow all sorts of oysters, like pink oysters, yellow oysters, blue oysters, pearl oysters. I've even used it to grow king oysters, and it works really, really well. Now, straw is really great for making these straw logs. You basically just take polytubing and you pasteurize it and you stuff it in here with mushroom grain spawn and you can grow all sorts of oyster mushrooms. It works really well. But straw does have some downsides. First of all, it's really messy. If you use straw to grow mushrooms, I promise you, you're going to find it everywhere. It's going to be coming out of all your clothing. You're going to find it in every corner of your house because it's really, really messy. In order to use it, you got to chop it up and that creates just straw everywhere. And it's not something you really want to use inside your house. The other downside is that straw will often be quite dirty. So if you go pick up a bale of straw from a farmer somewhere, there's a chance that it's just been sitting in a barn and it's wet and it might be covered in all sorts of other contaminants and all sorts of other stuff. So you're going to have to be sure that you clean it properly, pasteurize it properly before it's going to be good to use. Or even better, if you can find clean straw, that's going to work best. Now, I have seen some stuff on Amazon called Easy Straw, and it's already chopped, it's already clean, and it looks like it'd be a lot better than just buying a random bale of straw, but it is a lot more expensive. I think it's something like $40 or something like that compared to the $3 you might be able to get a bale of straw for. But if you can find straw and if you have the tools to be able to pasteurize it outside, then it's a great way to go. Now, if you want to learn how to grow oyster mushrooms on straw, I do have a separate video for that, so you can go watch that over here. The other substrate I want to talk about that works really well with just pasteurization is pure wood shavings. Wood shavings work amazingly well for oysters. I haven't tried them with lion's mane, but it's just plain old hardwood. So it probably works really well for all sorts of gourmet mushrooms, but oysters in particular will absolutely love wood shavings. Now, the best type of woods are hardwoods. You want to find something like aspen or oak, and you will want to avoid the softwood. So don't use spruce, pine, or fir because they won't really work well for growing mushrooms. And you definitely want to avoid cedar chips because, well, cedar is antifungal. But if you can find a really good hardwood, the wood shavings of those work really great for growing mushrooms. Now, a great place to find this, if you don't have wood shavings just kicking around, is actually at the pet store. It's the same stuff they use to make like animal bedding or hamster, guinea pig bedding. So if you go to the pet store quite often, you can find big old bags of aspen wood chips for really cheap. And if you've seen the 5-gallon bucket video that we did for growing oyster mushrooms, this is exactly what we used. Was aspen wood chips from the pet store. Another substrate that only requires pasteurization is something called cocoa coir. And I know somebody in the comments is going to tell me that I'm pronouncing wrong. I don't actually know how to pronounce it, but cocoa coir is basically coconut husk that's been compressed into a block, and it works really well for growing mushrooms, and it's also easy to find. You can find it at your local hardware store. You can often find it at pet stores as well. And typically what it's used for is for using the plants stuff and kind of helping to retain that moisture. And that's what it does really well, is it retains moisture, but it's also an organic material that mushrooms love to grow on. A lot of people, when they use cocoa coir, will mix it 50-50 with vermiculite. So vermiculite and cocoa coir is a great substrate for all sorts of mushrooms. And you just got to make sure that you hydrate it the right amount and you pasteurize it, and mushrooms will absolutely love it. Cocoa coir can be pasteurized as simply as just adding boiling water to a brick of cocoa coir inside of a bucket, then wrapping it in a blanket and leaving it overnight. By the time you come into the bucket the next day, it'll be cooled down, it'll be fully pasteurized, it'll be ready to add your mushroom mycelium. Now, if you want to grow mushrooms in these grow bags and you have access to either a pressure cooker or an autoclave, you might want to consider using some substrates that actually require sterilization. Now, these are higher nutrition substrates that are going to work really well for growing mushrooms and produce really big flushes. And you can find some substrates that the mushrooms just absolutely love, and you get a ton of yield out of your substrate. This will allow you to make some pretty fancy recipes and basically make any substrate you want to grow any kind of mushroom that can be cultivated. Now, for any type of hardwood-loving mushrooms, I always start with these hardwood fuel pellets as a base. Now, these are basically just hardwood sawdust that has been compressed into a pellet, and you can buy it in a big bag, and they're actually pretty cheap, and they rehydrate really well. So I've talked about this before, but the recipe that I like to use for all sorts of gourmet mushrooms is for every 5-pound fruiting blocks, for every 5-pound bag, I'm going to be using 5 cups of hardwood fuel pellets. I'm using about 1.25 cups of wheat bran, and I'm going to use about 1.4 liters of water. So basically just a big tote. I put the wood pellets in there, and then I dunk in the water, and it mixes up to this nice sawdust, and then I add the wheat bran, mix it up, and then pressure sterilize it for 2.5 hours at 15 psi. I've used this mix for basically every type of oyster, for lion's mane, for shiitake, for reishi, for nameko, for chestnut mushrooms. All sorts of mushrooms will really like this mix. And you really don't need to do too much else than this. I mean, you can get really fancy with your recipes, but this one works really well. Now, another substrate that is just killer for oyster mushrooms is something called the Master's Mix. The original master who came up with this mix is somebody named T.R. Davis from Earth Angel Mushrooms. And I was watching his YouTube channel a long time ago, and I had to try this mix. I was just blown away by how well it worked for oyster mushrooms. The recipe is simple. It's just a 50-50 mix of hardwood sawdust and soy hulls, and then it's hydrated to 60%. And sterilized again at 15 psi for 2.5 hours. Now, soy hulls, if you don't know, are just kind of the exterior skin of soybeans, and they're kind of just a waste product of soybean farming. For whatever reason, these soy hulls are just an awesome substrate for producing huge fruits, massive fruitings, and just like these massive yields of oyster mushrooms. It also seems to produce, for whatever reason, just like really nice dense clusters and really nice dense mushrooms. Now, soy hulls might actually be hard for you to find depending on where you live, but the recipe that I use for the Master's Mix is for every 5-pound fruiting block, again, is just 2.5 cups of soy hull pellets, 2.5 cups of hardwood fuel pellets, and then about 1.4 liters of water, which hydrates it about 60%. Then again, you pressure sterilize it for 2.5 hours at 15 psi, and you're going to have a beautiful substrate for growing oyster mushrooms. Of course, there are some mushrooms that do like manure. These are the dung-loving mushrooms, and the most common one is the button mushroom, or Agaricus bisporus, which actually does grow on composted manure. Now, this is usually done on an industrial scale, where they have these giant piles of compost, and it can be really hard to kind of replicate this at home. That being said, if you can find some composted manure, you can make a nice substrate for dung-loving mushrooms. I've done this with Cuprinus scomatus or shaggy mane. You basically just use a little bit of manure. I use like compost cow manure, and then you mix it with 50-50 vermiculite and cocoa coir, and then hydrate it to the right amount, and again, sterilize it or pasteurize it, and it works really well. Now, what about coffee for a substrate? You hear this a lot, right? Where people are growing mushrooms on spent coffee grounds. And although it does work, you can grow oyster mushrooms on spent coffee grounds, it really isn't a great substrate. It's really prone to contamination because it's really high in nitrogen. So unless you're really careful, there's a good chance that your project's going to get contaminated if you try to grow oyster mushrooms on straight coffee grounds. And really, it's just not a great substrate. I mean, you might have some success adding coffee to hardwood sawdust as a bit of a, a nutritional substitute for the mushrooms, but just growing on pure coffee grounds is not perfect. It still could be a fun project, so you might want to give it a try, but it's not the best substrate for growing mushrooms, in my opinion. So whether or not you want to grow mushrooms on coffee grounds, or you want to use one of the proven recipes that I talked about here, you don't need to limit yourself to these, because mushrooms are tenacious, especially oyster mushrooms. They can grow in all sorts of different materials, and it might be fun to experiment and try different things. I've even seen people grow oyster mushrooms on like cigarette butts, crying out loud. So maybe have fun, experiment, and try some different substrates. And yeah, that's it for this video. I hope that was helpful, and see you in the next one.
All right. In one quick second. Cool. So, two quick things that Tony talked about is pasteurization versus sterilization. Pasteurization is just going to be a mostly sterile process, but sterilization is going to be 100%. Everything else is out of there. It's a completely clean slate. There are mushrooms like oysters that you can get away with more of like a pasteurized instead of like a full sterilization. I always say go with the full sterilization just to make sure that you have that nice empty slate. It keeps you from rolling the dice a little bit. And then the second thing I wanted to bring up that Tony talked about is manure. So mushrooms are either typically a wood lover or a manure lover. And it's important to know which one you're trying to cultivate. The little button mushrooms you try to get at the grocery store, the little creminis and white button mushrooms, those are going to be your compost based, sorry to say, but manure loving mushrooms. There's a litany of other ones, but I mostly deal with the wood lovers, and I kind of recommend you stay in that playscape too. Angel, did you want to quickly talk about these questions in the chat?
Let's go ahead and address some of these. So, there's some good suggestions about using pellets from Daniel. there were some concerns about binders and additives. So he confirmed, and this isn't something I know, but yeah, definitely those are all concerns and could inhibit and change the growth. So let's see, what other questions? I dropped a link so you all can follow Fresh Cap Tony, but you can find more info at freshcap.com. And let's see, some other let's see. Oh, so somebody was curious how to pasteurize the manure, how that's done.
Yes. You can do this two ways. One is like a chemical way, and one is like a heat pressure sterilization thing. Typically you'll want to, at the home scale, you want to do like a heat pressure sterilization. So don't use that. Make sure you have a dedicated pressure cooker for your mycology, and don't use that for your canning or whatnot if you're trying to play around with manure loving mushrooms. The bucket tech that Tony outlined is also helpful for pasteurizing manure substrate, where you just get everything into the 5-gallon bucket. You put in a bunch of boiling hot water in there, a certain amount of boiling hot water. There's ratios and measurements that you can find online for manure loving, and dump that all in a 5-gallon bucket. Put the lid on, and the heat will slowly pasteurize the manure after a while.
So Sadie is asking, when we put our mason jars in the pressure cooker, are we covering them with foil or something else?
That's a great question. I really appreciate you bringing that up. So I will almost completely seal the mushroom jar, and I'll give it a little quarter turn to let air exchange. But what you'll do is you'll put a foil lid on top of that, and that'll make sure that nothing goes in, but things are still allowed to go out, keeping the pressure inside your jars nice and avoidant of exploding on you.
Okay, and Blake, you asked about chanterelles, but I wasn't sure what the context was. Yeah, what about tree root lovers? I've never seen chanterelles cultivated, but anybody else has? Like, tell me about it, because I want to know.
Yeah. Yeah, this brings up, like, there are a lot of mushrooms that just cannot be farmed. Like, if you think about a morel mushroom, you'll only find those like dried from a grocery store, because tons and tons of mushroom farmers are spending billions of dollars trying to figure out how can they reliably farm this mushroom, and it's just not there yet. So
Yeah,
those mushrooms,
it's a
chanterelles,
mycorrhizal.
yeah,
Yeah,
those
mycorrhizal fungi.
those all want a healthy ecosystem with all of their buddies in that ecosystem present and talking to them before they do their mushroom thing. So you need so many other players on the court for chanterelles, morels, bunch of other ones.
And morels can be cultivated, and there's a lot of debate in the science community going back and forth about, are they mycorrhizal or are they saprotrophs? And so the Danish Morel Project is one to follow if you guys want to learn about cultivating morels, and they're cultivated quite prolifically in Asia too. So they can be, it's just more of creating the ideal substrate again, like knowing the type of substrates that they like, and it's more mineral content and than it is, yeah, from what I've read, it's like you need very alkaline soil. And a lot of companies that sell morel spawn also sell it with ryegrass. So there's definitely something going on with the grass, and that's something that when you dig into Danish Morel Project, like they do not want to give you any information about why they grow ryegrass with their morels.
Well, I know what YouTube rabbit hole I'm going to go down after the presentation's over. Any more quick questions before we move it on along? All right. Cool. So now we're going to talk about fruiting conditions versus spawning conditions. After you've introduced a spawn to a substrate, we should start to encourage spawning conditions. This requires prioritizing a carbon-rich environment for your substrates. Let your substrates sit ideally with a lot of humidity. And throughout the first 10 to 15 days, you should start to see the spawn slowly colonize the substrate. You'll see a really nice, fully covered surface of mycelium. And that's when you know that you're doing good. You're making the fruiting conditions. You're encouraging spawning conditions. And then once you start to see little pins, as we talked about, the teeny tiny little mushrooms starting to develop on the surface of your substrate, that's when we can switch to fruiting conditions. They want that switch on as soon as you see pins. They want a heavy carbon dioxide rich environment before they start fruiting. And then as soon as we see those little pins, we'll immediately flip the script and go heavy oxygen, very little carbon dioxide. If you don't make that switch, your mushrooms are going to get suffocated in there. They're not going to get access to air, and they're going to become stringy and leggy and severely reduce your harvest. All right. A lot of these techniques, equipments, processes, cultures can seem really, really expensive. Like a flow hood out the assembly line is going to cost you thousands of dollars, but we can do things low budget. We could perform all the processes in a homemade still air box made for less than $15 by itself. You can reuse mason jars continuously instead of buying single-use unicorn bags. You can clone the cultivars you would like to grow instead of buying liquid cultures every time. You can grow out your mushrooms in a monotub, which can be made for as low as $7, but I would recommend spending just a little bit more than that to get a nice, more upgraded version of a monotub. And a pressure cooker is not required to sterilize your grain and substrate, but I would imagine you could find some cheap ones at Craigslist or Goodwill or garage sales. Just try to be resourceful and think of like, how can I acquire all these materials within my own budget, within my own context. I don't want to go and break the bank trying to do this and have to explain to my significant other why I can't take them out to dinner because I bought a bunch of substrate. All right. And real quick, in conclusion, I do hope that you dive into the process of cultivating mushrooms through these sterile techniques. The materials, the practices, and the growing processes are all really accessible, and with the right applied know-how, sorry, let's do that again. The materials, the practices, and the growing processes are all acceptable with the right applied know-how, and now you know how. I'm going to do a little bit of not slideshows. I'm going to make my camera the main screen and get into a little bit of physical demonstrations here. And I did see one quick question from Nick about humidity during fruiting. You also want humidity during fruiting. You want at least 80%, 88% sometimes relative humidity for your mushrooms. The humidity will hydrate the substrate. The substrate is where your mushrooms get its water. If you're spraying your mushroom thinking that's how you're watering it, that's not. It's the substrate through the humidity that lets your mushrooms access water. How do you prevent the fungus flies? I don't really, fungus gnats. I don't really come across fungus gnats if I'm like sterilizing my grains and my substrates effectively. That really just burns off any amount of fungus gnats. And if you're like planting things with potting mix or potting soil, there's usually a lot of little fungus gnat eggs that are dormant in there. And typically before I start planting up some seeds or whatnot, I'll put in boiling hot water to hydrate my potting mix, which will kill off all those fungus gnats. Alrighty, I am going to stop sharing real quick. And I want to say I'm big on the screen. I'm trying to figure out how to enlarge my screen real quick. Am I big? Is my face all over the? No, I don't know. I'm trying to see how I can integrate webcam. How do you encourage carbon dioxide rich environments? Actually, I guess you'll just need to see me through the little box. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen so we just have something nice in the background. Okay, if we have you active, speaker setting. Okay, cool. Thank you for letting me know. All right. So how do you encourage a carbon dioxide rich environment? You're going to want to place your substrate in some sort of sealed container, much like this sealed container. This is just a tote I got at Target for $9. And typically, if I wanted to make this my monotub, which is where I would have my end substrate, pardon me, I'll do two things. I'll go around and I'll start to make these little air gaps. So I will make one on this side. See there? I'll make two on this side. I'll make one on this side. And then I'll make two on this side. And every single place where I just put a little circle, two on the long side, one each on the smaller, narrower side, I will cut those out and I'm going to place these little things. These are breathable little air filters. And this will make sure that everything in the tub can breathe, but nothing can travel through these as far as like other molds, yeasts, things like that. And when I'm trying to encourage carbon rich environments, I'll just put like a bit of tape over it, or I'll put like a sheet of paper just so I can kind of suffocate my little air filters. And that'll encourage a carbon rich environment instead of like trying to make my living space some sort of carbon dioxide rich environment. You always want to grow in some sort of sealed container. And then when I'm trying to switch to fruiting conditions, I'll just let all that air flow right through, take off those tapes, and that'll allow my substrate to breathe. And now I want to talk about how to make a monotub. So again, same tub, but we're going to take one face of the tub, we're going to turn it upside down, and this is how you're going to interact with it. Laying face down like this, you're going to cut two hand-sized holes into this thing and do all of your preparation in here, all your pouring agar, cloning, every little process we talked about. You're going to want to do it within the confines of one of these still air boxes, and that'll make sure that you're not letting any sort of latent stuff in the air come into contact with your plates or any of your sort of sterile pieces of whatever part of the process you're in, whether that's grain or substrate or solutions, yada, yada, yada. You want to do your work inside a still air box. I'm actually kind of in my own still air box. I'm in a giant grow tent right now, so none of the stuff in my apartment flying around is really coming into contact with me. Still very not a sterile air in here, but more sterile than outside my grow tent right now. So I'm going to be doing these processes here kind of freehand, but just keep it in context. When you do this at home, you're going to want to do this either with a flow hood or inside a still air box. If I tried to put my camera up to the wall of this tote, everything would look really hazy, and I don't think the point would come across so well. So I'm going to put on some gloves now. I'm going to spray myself down with a bunch of isopropyl alcohol, 70%, much like we talked about. And again, it's a really simple process. You're going to see me do it right now, and everything's pretty easy to get into the groove of. And kind of get my sleeves just a little bit, just to make sure. I totally just shot some alcohol in my water, but it's the wrong alcohol. Again, I'm just going to get my hands going with just a bit of isopropyl alcohol, and then we're going to get into some other stuff. Go down just a little bit. So I'm going to spray down that box of agar plates just so that anything that I get my hands on or that comes into contact with me is sterile. They really seal these agar plates, but that's a good thing. All right. So whenever you're buying agar plates for your home processes, I'm gonna kind of show everything to the camera. I'm gonna hold it up, as opposed to just showing you my lab. So I got my agar plates here. They're in a completely tight environment. You can see here that it gives you some information, usually like a batch ID. This is how you know who to trust. And if you were just sent a bunch of loose plates in a random Amazon box, I would not use those, and I would probably report that seller as someone doing something they probably shouldn't. And now, before I open this, I'm just gonna give it a good little spray here. You never use too much of 70% isopropyl alcohol. Just making sure I can rub that in a little bit so that it's pretty sterile. All right. It's so impossible to do with slick gloved hands, but it's important. All right, I'm in. So make sure to spray down my surface. And that's what your agar plates will look like. And as soon as this thing's fully colonized, it'll just be like one nice, beautiful white disc that looks like art. And if you see any sort of contamination in there, it'll be like a weird blue or weird green. You'll think that there's something growing in here, kind of like the thing, but nothing to worry about. Just contamination's easy enough to notice when you see it.
So Austin, can you move the camera down? Because we can't see what you're doing with your hands.
Yeah. Let's see here. All right.
Little,
Aha.
a little
Is that
further
okay?
down.
A little further down.
There you go.
All right. Cool. So I have my plates here. I'm going to go ahead and just lightly go around them and just make sure that, again, everything's sterile. They came pre-sterilized, but I just opened a bag and set them on a table, so that I might have introduced another factor of contamination. So I'm just going to be really, really diligent, really deliberate about my process here. And then I'm going to set those down. I'm going to lightly spray my syringe. Go over everything. And the syringes all come with a little instruction manual on there. Tells you everything you need to know. Grab my syringe and my needle. Be very careful with this stuff. And I doubt you'll be able to see, but there are all these little strands of like flakes of mycelium in there. I don't think my camera's that good. Now I'm going to place the syringe. Oops. Materials. Yeah. Out. And then you just attach your needle like so. And before I do anything else, I will need to flame sterilize this. Unfortunately, all I have with me is just a regular old candle lighter. And this is where you want to be very careful. Syringe is very sharp. It's also a really thick one too. So it kind of makes me think about when you're at the blood bank donating blood and it asks you if you've ever had an accidental needle stick. Just like, yeah, I was doing some mushroom cultures and things happen. Cool. So the first thing we're gonna do, like we talked about, I'm just gonna take some of the beginning pieces of it and just get that out of here. So it comes out in just a couple of drops. And now this is nice and well mixed. Everything I just shot into that glass was probably mostly water as opposed to a nice mix between mycelium and solution. And now I'm just going to quickly go again with the lighter for a little bit. Just between each process. All right, and then I'm just going to do about 2.5 to 5 cc's right on the plate, and then immediately close that plate. And then do it again, just enough to open it. Don't want to expose it to air. And it's literally just like a few drops here and there. All right, and I will set that right there. The next thing you're going to want to do is use some of this specialty tape you can find pretty cheap. It's like a nice flexible tape, and this is just going to seal the plates, making sure that the lid doesn't fall off. Pretty much between making any hand motions, I'll just hit my hands and whatever it is I'm pulling up with some isopropyl alcohol. And now we just go.
Austin, are you there? We lost you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes,
Okay. Let me
but he froze.
what happened? Hopefully he didn't get kicked off the internet.
Hmm.
Well, hopefully he'll, maybe it's like a power issue.
I wonder if he realizes that he froze up on us all.
Okay. Looks like he had a power outage, like a little surge at his house. So he's going to be back in about a minute after his internet reboots. Yeah, y'all. Technical difficulties always. Anybody else having problems with power issues with all of our I guess we're over 50 days now of 100 degrees.
Just my body powered.
The city said we're supposed to reduce electricity usage from 3 to 8 today.
Oh, I wonder if that might be some sort of little,
Maybe rolling blackout time.
Well, it's
yeah.
8. Yeah, so
So it was just like a blip. So. All right. Anybody else have any other general questions that I may be able to answer? Questions about gardening, foraging? Can also
Hey, now's a good question.
Yeah.
the mushroom blocks. I
Yeah.
know a lot of them are still showing green and
Yeah.
have blocks, but
Yes.
how fresh are they? I've been to a couple of them and looks like they've been there for a long time and probably all dried
Yeah.
up. Are
This is
we thinking of refreshing a lot of those? Um,
so yeah, so Joseph does all the coordination, and with the heat and um they're great for composting. So this time of year, like once temps get over 80, the mushroom blocks are mostly just good for doing compost. And that green you see on the block is called trichoderma, which is one of the most commonly grown fungus in the world. It's everywhere. It's in all the soils. And it's something that it actually is an endophytic fungi, or it's green mold, but it's endophytic and it helps plants with the roots and all that sort of stuff. So it's not a bad thing to use for composting, but it is one of the things that indoor cultivators they really really don't like. So if you get trichoderma growing, you pretty much have to compost or throw out your what you have growing. So, but back to the block program. So because things are so hot, and if you've ever volunteered with us, you know how labor intensive those blocks are, pretty heavy. So we're not kind of super active right now, only if people are signing up, wanting to get them for their own projects. Are we kind of refreshing some of the sites? But once temperatures start to drop here mid-September, things will pick up again. But yeah, we
Okay.
just don't want to kind of
That
ask
makes a
people to
lot
be
of sense.
doing a lot
Yeah,
of
I
heavy lifting during this kind of extreme heat we're having.
yeah, I use the blocks to put in an indoor grow room. I don't do all this fancy stuff successfully that Austin is showing. I'm trying, but what I do is I put the blocks in a humid room and try to get additional flushes.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I've been hoping to get some fresh blocks.
Well, if you're able to grow anything in 100 degrees or even like 90 something, like let us know.
No, yeah,
Because
no, I have a basement that stays a little a bit cooler than that, but
yeah.
yeah, we'll see.
All
Yeah,
right.
well, signing up to volunteer is like a good way to kind of get in there and get some blocks that are super fresh. So yeah, that's like another way to
Okay,
kind of,
so the blocks are available at the factories, but just we're not picking them up until the temperatures are down.
there are some spots that are there's new blocks. Like my house is it's the first pickup spot. And I've had like probably the same blocks for the longest period ever, since my house became a spot, and that's only 2 weeks. So yeah, but they're basically like crusty by the time things, um, just sitting outside for a day will dry them out, and trichoderma will just take over and outcompete.
I have returned.
Yay! Oh my gosh! So I'm hoping everybody else in Austin is doing their power's doing okay. Like I know somebody was saying like the city's doing some sort of like, or they're recommending people run their electricity lower at certain times of day. So
Yeah, I'm not using much electricity right here. I guess everybody else has their ACs and their ultra OLED TVs running. But
yeah,
I'll go ahead and hopefully am I good? Am I on everyone's screen
yeah,
now?
you're good. We see the lab.
Perfect. So where we left off is I use this specialty mycology tape that you can find for cheap through any place that usually sells agar plates or liquid cultures and stuff like that. And I just went around and I really tightly put that tape on there. And I also labeled my agar plate, so it's a black trumpet and today's date, and I will heavily monitor that throughout the next 2 to 3 weeks. Just make sure that I'm not getting any weird contamination. It just should look like a really nice white blanket of mycelium, And if there's anything else in there, it's no harm, no foul. I can try to take white mycelium from as far away on this plate from a contamination. If I'm seeing contamination at like this edge, I'll go to the opposite edge, take some mycelium from that and put it on a fresh plate. But now that I have these 3 plates, I also wanted to get into showing you grain. So this is a pretty affordable 3-pound bag of sterile grain from North Spore. Big fan of them. And I'm going to go ahead and take this out. I'm going to give it a light spritz of isopropyl alcohol all over. Rub that in just to make sure I'm not introducing anything if I can help it. You see, this is a nice tight bag, and it also comes with one of these. All right. Sterilize your bag before injection. All right. And you can see here, there's this small little square on here, and this is what's called a self-healing injection port. So I'm going to sterilize my needle again. I'm going to shove it in there, and I'm just going to give it a few drops, not too many drops. And then, as we saw earlier, as we were talking about grain, it's just going to slowly colonize this thing. And as I see a patch of colonization over the next week, I'm just going to really give this grain the business, mix it all around and redistribute that mycelium to help speed up the colonization process. This year, 3-pound bag will make for about 15 pounds of in substrate. So I'll make 3 5-pound bags of substrate, sterilize that, and then I will pour in a third of this bag into each of those. And if I wanted to just take the grain spawn that I have nice and colonized and mix it in with some straw or some mulch outside, that would also be useful. I would maybe mulch like 2 trees or maybe 20-30 square feet total with just one of these. But again, I'm going to try to wait for cooler temperatures to come by. We don't want to kill off all of our nice mycelium by introducing it to 90-degree weather. So let's set that right there. I'm going to go back in and give this some heat. Just want to make sure that I'm not dealing with any contamination if I can help it. Going to very gently stab that in there inside the grain, and I'm just giving it a few drops. Remove that, and then that little injection port now will just heal it nice, and I should see really good colonization. I'm going to store this bag right side up to make sure that all the gravity is bringing that liquid culture down, hopefully speeding up the process of colonization. I used specifically a Black King trumpet for this exercise, and we're going to give away some other ones here in a minute, but I believe that is all of the live demo aspects I had prepared. We can get into some more questions as I pull the stream back up, and I'm going to shove this stuff in my nice sterile box here. And I always like to grow in a monotub at home, even if I'm using bags from the recycled program. I will take the bag, I'll take it home, I'll start wiping it down with isopropyl alcohol, and then I'll place the bag in a monotub, and that'll give me the best chance for success using the recycled block program.
Okay, so Elizabeth asks, how do you sterilize big batches of substrate? And I may have missed this, but how do you clean a mushroom for cloning?
You'll just take like a rag and your isopropyl alcohol, rub it all over the mushroom. You can't eat that mushroom, but you're going to want to heavily sterilize the outside of that mushroom, much like I was sterilizing everything here with isopropyl alcohol. Sterilizing a large amount of grain at one time, I have an interesting idea. You can go and find like a ghost kitchen space where you can just like knock out a large amount of cooking at once and see whatever sort of, maybe they have a large canning machine or an autoclave, as it's called, autoclave, That's usually what people will do big batches of mushroom substrate sterilization in. I don't know if you'll be able to find it, but if there's a mushroom, anything in your area, you can ask them, a mushroom farm, any sort of mushroom businesses in your area, ask them about it, or you can, again, try to find some pre-sterilized bags you can buy if you want to go in the mass production route. I imagine someone's going to give you a good wholesale price, but it's going to be a lot of conversation before you get to that.
So what is the minimum footprint you'll need to do indoor mushroom, sort of with all your equipment, storage, etc.?
I want to say about 3 medium to large size totes. 1 tote to store all your stuff, 1 tote to make your still air box, and then 1 tote to make your monotub.
So what can you kind of give like an estimate on like this? I guess people are trying to decide like how much space in a room, or do I need like a room or a garage, like square footage?
Maybe about a closet's worth of room, like a really small closet, like your in between closets, or like your linen closet, how it just has a few shelves in there and it's a really small amount of space. That's all you need to do to be able to grow a lot of mushrooms in a really small amount of space. You don't need a big room. I'm here in my grow tent that's only like 5 feet by 5 feet, and I'll put in some shelves and I'll have either some blocks just sitting on the shelves or in tubs on the shelves. So small shelf space, just as much as like a closet or where you would store a little bit of clothes or a little bit of linens. Think about that kind of size.
Yeah, and some people like, did you already talk about the Martha tent, which is like if someone weren't wanting to do like a whole lot of, use like a big tent, could that just be an option as well?
Yes, you can make like a Martha tent and place it probably away from your bedroom, somewhere in like your living room. If you have like an outdoor patio door, I would place it somewhere around there. And then a Martha tent is like a greenhouse shelving for, like, if you think about like a greenhouse shelving for tropical plants inside your house, it's a plastic skin going over a metal shelving unit, and that's going to trap all the moisture in there. And you could modify that into a Martha tent by having some sort of humidity pump pumping in humidity and some sort of air exchange filter and fan pushing air out. And ideally, you're going to want to use some ducting to have all of that air being pushed out through a duct into a window or outside somewhere. A lot of people will modify like their window to have some sort of plywood and then metal ducting to shoot air out of their house, as opposed to just having like a bunch of humidity being shot into your living space. But Martha tents are great. And again, it's only like a small rack, just like whatever little bit of shelving, maybe like 3 feet by 2 feet wide, and then about 5 feet tall.
And so someone brought up light, which I think is a really important thing, because there are studies too that, and as we all know, like mushrooms are a good source of vitamin D, and, they have melanin in them, and they absorb the UV light and convert it into this valuable vitamin that a lot of us are deficient in. And so I'm curious just myself, like, how do you make sure that you get enough UV on in your indoor grow facility to where you're maximizing the amount of vitamin D you have in the mushroom?
I'm using like plant lights, LED full spectrum plant lights you could find. Make sure it is a full spectrum LED plant light. If you're just running on Amazon trying to find some rando plant light, that is probably a scam and not going to give the plants enough light nor your mushrooms enough light. All of your mushrooms are going to need, or all of your wood loving mushrooms and stuff are going to need about as much light as like a small herb plant would want. So it doesn't need to be a ton of light. You want to think about like a bunch of diffused light coming through a large tree onto the base of the tree, and think about how much light that hits that space with. And that's about as much light as you would want to give your mushrooms. If you can place your monotub, by a window, that'll be plenty of light. If you have a big sliding glass door, put your mushrooms over there, though they should get enough light. If you have a south facing window, that's ideal. But mushrooms, I don't think will get any vitamin D from growing in like a grow tent under my grow lights here. I would need to go and give them a little suntan session outside for a little bit. I think it's only about like 10 minutes of like outdoor exposure will charge some vitamin D into your mushrooms.
Yeah, I think
But I
you can drop the study in the chat, but yeah, like
perfect.
yeah.
All right, so I just wanted to provide some quick follow-up references here. We talked about fresh cap mushrooms. Here's 3 videos that'll really help you understand and comprehend and see a lot more visual aids. 7 tips to growing mushrooms by Fresh Cap Mushrooms. How to transfer mycelium. So you can look at, this is one fully colonized plate and then one colonizing plate. And you can swap mycelium from your fully colonized plate onto new plates to make more plates, or go from plate to grain, or those sorts of things. There's also a good YouTube channel called Philly Golden Teacher. I really appreciate. He has a great amount of sterilization techniques that he breaks down. It's all really accessible. It's all really easy. He shows you how to do it in all the array of equipment. He does things in still air boxes, and those videos can get a little grainy and foggy considering you're trying to look through a plastic tote, but that's why I avoided doing that today. And then growing mushrooms at home, it's an easy process. Fresh Cap Tony, he's got your back. He'll help you out.
Yeah. There's one more question that came up. So Stephanie asked, did you mention you had success with the recycled mushroom blocks growing when transferred to substrate? I am considering doing this or buying a pre-colonized grow kit spawn bag and transferring that a substrate bin to grow for a classroom. Not sure what the pros and cons are if the recycled blocks are more prone to contamination.
So the recycle block comes out of the mushroom farm and sits outside somewhere with a bunch of other mushroom blocks. Lots of risks of contamination there. We take them to a host site where they're still exposed to the elements. There's lots of contamination there. But only in the indoor setting, I want to say. If they're outdoors, it's still okay. And the mushrooms that you get from the mushroom block program are usually really fast growers, and they can outcompete some stuff, not all the stuff. So if it was me, if I was in your position, I would try to find I would ideally figure out which mushroom drop-off location is closest to me. And every day I would just go by, maybe check that out and see if any fresh ones are added. So like, I'll wait for it to get depleted. I'll make a mental note of that. And then every day I'll go out and make sure like, hey, did the freshest blocks get there? They did. I can confirm that. I don't need to bother anybody. I don't need to email anybody. I don't need to call Angel and be like, hey, I need a fresh block. I'll just kind of do that part myself, get that fresh block, and then I will wipe it down again with isopropyl alcohol and a paper towel to make sure I take off whatever outside contamination elements might be on the bag. And then I will place it in a tub. It is important to go in a tub because there's lots of stuff, again, in the air, in your homes, yeast and stuff like that. They want to get onto that substrate. Everything wants your substrate. And there's only one thing we want to take that substrate. So if you are trying to do this for a classroom thing, there's a lot of hurdles there, a lot of recipes for contamination. So you might want to just bite the bullet and make sure that you buy like a fully colonized, sterile mushroom block kit to bring into the classroom. That'll just give you the least amount of headaches. Trust me, the price is going to be worth it if you're trying to use it for an educational purpose.
Yeah, and if you follow the Facebook group for the pickup spot closest to you, then you can get updates. So
wonderful. I'm out of Facebook, so I didn't know that. And also, I would just leave it in the block. I wouldn't try to mix it into straw or whatever. The blocks will fruit another 1 or 2 times, so it's got enough to do what it does, and I wouldn't mess around with it anymore if as long as I didn't have to. Any more questions?
Do you need help eating your mushrooms?
Oh, no, I have a whole litany of strategies for extending my mushroom shelf life, which you should go and check out the Sanctuary Kitchen in Austin or in North Austin or just north of Austin.
Georgetown.
Well, yeah, Georgetown, there we go. And we talk about, or they talk about all sorts of things of like extending your mushroom harvest. I'm really into pickling. We had an event last Sunday about mushroom fermentation, and we got to try some mushroom kimchi that was just mind blowing. So, unfortunately, I have all the mushrooms I can eat, and I can store them for when I don't want to eat them.
And so, what do people mean when they say dunk a block? And I think I know what that is, but I actually don't do that myself.
Dunking doesn't seem. I don't know
Just-
about the word dunking. I'm not familiar with the process. I haven't heard of this.
Yeah, I've heard people talking about it for like a second flush, but yeah, I know people will dunk them. I've never done it myself. Like I personally do the cold pasteurization method and bucket tech, or I do trench composting. And to be quite honest, a lot of the second flushes really only happen when we get the nitrogen charged rainwater. Like, so we have an electrical storm. That's when you get your mushrooms regrowing because they need that electrical charge. And that's not something that, that's just something kind of anecdotal, but the Egyptians all hundreds of years ago believed that the storm god was the reason for mushrooms. And every time he would throw lightning bolts, mushrooms would grow. The Japanese also use electricity to do something to their shiitake logs to get better flushes. So there's definitely, I would love to get involved with an electrician or a electrophysicist, someone that was interested in mycology too, to look at that. I don't know, there may already be studies on this, and I'm curious if anybody looks at this, but there's definitely something that happens with the water that helps with flushing, but in a very controlled, simulated environment where
Yeah,
there's
we'll make
not a lot
a
of variables, like you can get somewhat consistent flushes, but even the mushroom farms, can't always explain like why things will go sometimes and then not other times. So there's a lot happening in the dark matter we haven't yet explored.
yeah, maybe we'll need to make a mushroom shaped Tesla coil and do some
That's
real mad science.
Yes. All right, next class.
All right, I'll start working on it. Any other questions before we ask some questions? All right, Angel, you ready?
Yeah, so everyone get your QWERTYs, get your keyboards warmed up. We're going to be doing the giveaway in the chat. So Austin's going to go to the screen with the trivia question. And so the first person on Zoom and the first person on the YouTube that answer correctly, we will be sending you some liquid cultures of your choice. So I will just need to know from you what you would like. And you'll have to email us the species you would like, but I'll drop in the chat like the choices that you have from North Sport. So
Awesome.
whenever you're ready.
All right, folks. I hope your keys are ready, because I want to know from you if you know what is the common name for this mushroom.
Oh,
Yay! Wow, Jane!
Jane,
Woohoo!
lightning
Yay.
fast Jane.
Awesome. So Jane on the Zoom. And so let's see. Let me just drop in the chat kind of the liquid cultures that are on North Spore. And then I'll pop over to YouTube and see who's won over there. Let's see. Spawn. Where did you find the liquid cultures on their website?
You got to go to like spawns and solutions, and then there's a tab for liquid cultures. I'll also show it on the stream real quick since I'm sharing my screen anyway.
See. Okay, well, if
So
you
folks,
do you
oh,
think
sorry.
that you could
Yeah, I'll put the link in the chat.
okay. All right. So on YouTube we have HL Newson, and we're gonna grab the link where we need to. So Chicken of the Woods season in Texas starts in August, and we get them growing on our beautiful heritage live oak trees. And every year there's one close to my house, and it's one of the first ones I see, usually about this time, middle of August. So I've been keeping an eye on this tree. So it's been growing Chicken of the Woods for like the last 3 years, 3 or 4 years now. So I'm keeping my eye on it. But we will be doing our Chicken of the Woods bike ride again this year, Myco Psycho. So it'll be the 3rd year that we do it. So we go through Central Austin, foraging for Chicken of the Woods. And last year we probably found like 20 pounds. So we're going to do it the same time of year. Hopefully we'll be synced up with the Egyptian god of lightning. And we will hopefully collect lots of Chicken of the Woods.
Cool. And so folks, this is North Spore Mycology. They have everything you want. They got spray and grow kits, fruiting blocks, substrate blocks. They got kits, they got everything. But this is their liquid culture syringe section. This is what I bought. I think that $20 is a fair price for pretty much any of these, and you could grow probably easy hundreds of dollars to thousands of dollars worth of mushrooms from one syringe, going to agar plates, making sure that you keep your agar plates. So it's sort of like a one and done. You do the one-time payment, and then as long as you keep up with your agar plates or your liquid cultures, you have an infinite amount of reproducible mushrooms from just one syringe. So $20 gets you the ticket to Disneyland. And then you can even select, hey, I'm a beginner, so I only want the beginning ones. Tells you those. Or like, hey, I want to go experimental here. I want to really roll the dice. And looks like morels are your most experimental. But I originally got into growing mushrooms indoors using these. There's just a $30 spray grow kit. It comes with a little mister. I just put it by my kitchen sink, which is like my most naturally humid environment in my home. And I was just spraying and growing these mushrooms, and that's what got me hooked. But I had no idea we had the mushroom block giveaway program, which is essentially the same thing minus $30.
Yes.
All right. So going back to the presentation, we have an event we're going to tomorrow. You can find me tomorrow at this wonderful art exhibit called Realms of Fungi. It's up North Austin in the Domain. And we'll be there. We'll be talking everything art, mushrooms, culture, and we'll just hang out, myceliate, and get immersed in the realms of fungi. We also talked about coming next month, our next speaker. Do you want to talk a little bit more about it?
Yeah. So yeah, our next event, I just added it up on the website today, so you can register to join us online or in person. So we will be learning about the sociology of mushroom poisonings. So with my ecologist Dennis Benjamin. So he's originally from South Africa, has a very interesting perspective on mycology. You know, he grew up during the apartheid there. And so his skepticism of the government really kind of influences his, interest in mushrooms and how he interacts with them in the real world. And so, yeah, so you can come learn from him. And then the following day, we also have a watercolor workshop. So, yeah.
Awesome, folks. And we're nearing the end. You can whip out your phone and take a photo or scan this QR code with your phone camera so that you can take this presentation home with you, have it as reference material, follow up with those YouTube channels we talked about. And hopefully this hasn't been an intimidating process with you. You saw me do everything here live. I'm not a scientist. I don't have thousands of dollars. I just have a lot of passion.
Yes, and we hope you all will too. But yeah, so if there aren't any other questions, then we will sign off here in a little bit. But yeah, we're usually open to any kind of questions, so feel free to come off mute or or ask
And
it
my
in the
apologies about the power issue. The Texas electrical grid is a fragile, fickle friend.
Yay. Thanks everyone for your warm messages. Hope to see you in person soon.
Hope to see you tomorrow at the art gallery opening, Realms of Fungi. It'll be a lot of fun.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Steve. All right.
All right. I think we got it done.
All right. End the live stream.